Good evening, everybody. My name is Lucinda. I'm your host for tonight's podcast. And this is Affirm Relationships, informing you about how the show births the roles that men and women hold in relationships and intimate moments of the lives of these entertaining individuals. This podcast covers topics such as edifying, strengthening, and demystifying relationships in our society and their relevance to our culture today. You will be educated, empowered, entertained, and enlightened. We love your feedback, so if you have a topic you would like to hear on the show, please comment below. Again, like I said, my name is Lucinda, and I will be your host this evening for the show. The topic that we're going to cover tonight is intimacy and boundaries. Are you carrying baggage into a new relationship from the past? A little bit about my story. Intimacy is very important to me. Boundaries are also very important to me. And I have experienced a great deal of challenges in past relationships. I was widowed in 2006 from a marriage. And then I jumped right into a relationship that I wasn't quite ready for emotionally at the time. So really, I was looking for intimacy in the wrong places, and that created some pretty poor boundaries. And sometimes those issues or challenges can create some boundary lines that are blurry. They can create walls that are put up that create challenges for other relationships or new relationships that you're trying to have and create. So I think, some of the things that maybe our culture or people have gotten away with is just what the idea of intimacy is all about. I think that oftentimes people are assuming that intimacy is dual or physical, and so they search for those kind of things. I know I certainly did. I just searched for something, so I didn't really have a firm idea or really didn't know that I was struggling to keep my firm idea of what intimacy was. And I think intimacy can be lots of different things besides just sexual or physical, that it can be just the closeness of friendships that grows into more. So again, my name is Lucinda, and I'm your host for this evening. And we are talking about intimacy and boundaries and how those issues or baggage from previous relationships can sometimes sneak into new relationships and make those difficult to have. Oftentimes, I think that people can look for the physical and not necessarily the intimate. And if they're looking for the physical, then they're just looking for somebody present for them to be with, rather than really a close friendship that then goes into seeing other ways besides physical. Intimacy, I think, can be calling somebody in early morning hours or times when you are more fearful or really need somebody to be vulnerable with. I think vulnerability goes pretty closely with intimacy. Both of those are very difficult, I think, to have or to deal with sometimes, but I think they go hand in hand pretty well. Thing that isn't easily talked about either. I think maybe, oftentimes women have an easier time talking about intimacy, or it's maybe welcomed more. Intimacy is something that is important to talk about, more important to create, and sometimes that can be difficult if boundaries are up or blurred, because then sometimes the genuineness is lost. So we always welcome feedback, comments, questions. Feel free to join in the call and comment or question anything that you might have. I can only speak, of course, to my personal experiences. I said that I was widowed in my first marriage. And my second marriage, the relationship that I got into a little too quickly, that has created more boundaries for new relationships I might have in my life, because some of that baggage can creep into, well, is this going to happen? Or is this person going to possibly do what the other person did? And then there's a lot of walls. I know that that's true for myself and always will be. Opportunity for growth to always learn and be comfortable with vulnerability and intimacy, especially after experiencing challenges in past relationships. So my second relationship, there's been baggage that has not been, I think baggage can sometimes be a little unfair to the new person in your life. And that's a point of communication that is very important to have as well. So communicating that in the very beginning of that relationship, which again, I think requires vulnerability. And that's always scary and something new. If you have that communication open with that person, that new person that you're trying to have a relationship with, then sometimes it doesn't have to be so scary. Again, I think that sometimes, in society and in our culture, it is more okay for the woman to be vulnerable, or some women might get that message. But I think it's very important that both parties are vulnerable and able to communicate, especially if there is baggage that comes from both parties. And I think that most people have baggage when they come into a new relationship, and it's just important to communicate that. Some of the baggage that I can speak to, I think that going through the challenge of emotional abuse to abuse, that's when it also gets very difficult to be vulnerable, because you just want to, I know I did in my experience, just wanted to keep that wall up and not really share what had happened to me before, because you just don't want to open new wounds. But in order to communicate all those challenges, in order to help create that intimacy and keep the intimacy going, it's important to talk about those things. And I know that's what I experienced with a lot of emotional abuse. And that can be something that creates a feeling of not being wanted, which has been difficult to bring intimacy into the picture. And again, I'm speaking about topics that I experienced myself, that very important, that maybe other people have experienced as well. And it's just not easy to talk about. But again, I think intimacy is not just a physical thing or something that is created by something physical, not just who you allow to touch you physically, but who you talk to when you want to talk about your dreams, what do you want to talk about your fears in general, or previous fears that you may wonder if they're going to occur again, or just things that you need to discuss or talk about. The people that you call, the person that you call in those moments, that to me is the intimate moments as well, if not more so, because that's when you're very vulnerable and you're very open to having some support. So I'm curious, when I saw this topic and what this topic was going to be, I am curious about what other people see intimacy as and what that looks like, because I think that most people go to the physical part. Could be wrong about that, and many people think that intimacy is a friendship and those conversations about what you want to do and what dreams you have, and not only the fears, but also a part of the solution, or who that person or what that person is going to do in order to be a part of the solution. So again, those are the things that I think of when I think of intimacy. When I think of boundaries, boundaries can mean a couple things to me. Boundaries can mean what you will or will not accept in that relationship. So the walls that you put up. And oftentimes, I know, again, for me, the boundary or the wall that I've had to put up is for a defense mechanism. And those aren't always necessary. They might be necessary in the moment For me, it was. Those walls were a defense mechanism for the moment to get myself out of the situation where I could see clearly and the fog had been lifted. They aren't necessarily there to stay permanent. They're there to get you through, and then those can be torn down, and then that allows for the intimacy to occur. It allows the friendship to grow. It allows lots of things to develop and bloom. And I think oftentimes the walls and the boundaries can be blurred because somebody wants intimacy so badly. So if somebody looks for intimacy and wants just a person to be their person, to be there in those times of challenges and so excitement, sometimes that can cause this overwhelming excitement that isn't necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes that excitement or any other overwhelming feeling can create some blurred lines. And that's when the boundaries can get blurred and not be maybe as structured for that relationship as it needs to be. I think it all continues to come back to communication. And I think that it's something to speak to about communication is very important. If there is baggage and if there is strong walls being brought into a new relationship, communication is very hard to do. And again, just because it's hard doesn't necessarily mean that it's impossible. But I know, again, in my situation, I got to a point in my relationship, my second marriage, where I was scared to speak up because I didn't really know the reaction that I was going to get. And I started to forget how to communicate. And that's when boundaries definitely did not exist. And if they were very blurred. And after that relationship, and after I had time to get out of that place, I was able to see that communication is still important and it's not lost. It just got hard for a while. So again, I'm curious, just as I was with intimacy, about what people and what the listeners consider to be boundaries that are important, boundaries that could even enhance intimacy, that you would communicate in the beginning of a relationship. I'm also curious as to how much information people think they need to or should share with someone that's new in your life. And again, for anybody that just joined us or is just listening, I'm Lucinda, your host, and I've been talking about intimacy and boundaries and relationships and what might happen or what could happen if there is baggage brought into relationships, how that might affect intimacy, how that might affect boundaries. And again, I can only speak for my own experience. Intimacy, with all of the scariness of intimacy, when you find that, I think that it's something that is indescribable. I think that it's something that is indescribable for a reason, because you just share it with the person that matches that intimacy for you. And I think that all that communication that you might have in the beginning definitely can help the intimacy. But, like I said before and earlier, the intimacy can also be not even just a conversation. It doesn't even have to be talking, I don't believe. Intimacy can be just being with somebody, physically present in the room or on the phone or doing something. It doesn't necessarily have to be the conversation or the physical. I think that that's something that is like the coolest part of a relationship, is true intimacy. And if you find it, it's definitely worth something to hold on to. And I think that intimacy is also important, no matter how distracted you are. I'm a mother of two boys. 13 and 10. And Lord knows that there's plenty of distractions with the 13 and the 10-year-old. And regardless of those distractions, I hope that when I am able to provide or give or share myself with my significant other, no matter how distracted I am with my children. I'm also a teacher, and so with the distractions of the day-to-day duties of being a teacher, that intimacy is still something that I am I'm able to provide or just have, no matter how distracted I am. So, I again, I'm curious about whether or not, maybe some people find intimacy to be much easier than others, and communication to be much easier than others. Before I had experienced the challenges that I had experienced, I would say that those things were much easier. I think that challenges always make something a little more difficult, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a solution and there isn't something that you can share. One of the things that I thought about when I thought about this topic is it's so difficult, I think, to decide what exactly you want to share in the sense of your baggage, which is part of your story and that you wish to be intimate with. Typically, when I tell my story, it's a story that a lot of people don't want to hear or they get uncomfortable with because it's a sad story. Me being widowed at an early age and then getting into a relationship I wasn't emotionally ready for, that can be a really sad story. And so that's a lot of baggage. And I think that, or I wonder if some people don't necessarily share baggage or information or communicate or let the walls down because they're scared of that baggage scaring somebody away, or that baggage being too much for that person to handle. And is there a time, is there an amount of baggage to share, and when? I think that any of this can be dependent upon the person and dependent upon their relationship and where you are. But I think that's something that is often on the minds of people that have baggage and that start a relationship. How much do you share and when? So again, that's a question in my mind that I myself have experienced, and I don't necessarily have the answers for because I think that it can depend on that person and that relationship. Also, wondering if just the question or the wonder about that information and when to share it can create a hesitancy or a boundary in a relationship. And again, if that boundary or that wall is up, then the intimacy is difficult to find or difficult to have. And so all those questions kind of can distract you and cloud your mind. There's always or can always be a time for intimacy, because if I, again, were thinking about that, it's one of the best parts of the relationship, whether it's a new relationship or an old relationship. I think it's one of the best parts of the relationship because you can feel safe and vulnerable with somebody that's important to you, somebody that you're getting to know, somebody that you're wanting to or considering sharing your life and a lot of other things with. So it's a topic. I think that intimacy and the boundaries, I think that is a really tough topic to find or kind of figure out how it all works because they're tough. I think they're both very important, and I think that it's they're topics that a lot of people don't necessarily maybe want to talk about because of the level of comfort or discomfort that they bring. I think that, a lot of times I've wondered if a lot of the relationships or the idea of relationship are, they shy away from the idea of sharing things and being intimate, and it's based more on the physical. And whether it is or isn't, whether I'm right or wrong, intimacy can be one of the best parts, even if it's very scary even if it's hard, of the relationship. And I think there's lots of, people are, oh, well, maybe this baggage that I'm bringing to this relationship is too difficult, or maybe it's too scary, or maybe it's too sad in my situation. I'm always curious if my baggage is too sad. And should I really bring it up, or should I really talk about it? And how in the world do I build a new relationship when that baggage is sad? But if that isn't, maybe that's not my job to decide if it's sad or not. Maybe it's my job to just be as open as I can be and trust that information giving me the opportunity to open up a little bit and welcome intimacy and welcome communication and welcome strong, healthy boundaries, which then create a successful relationship. So I think that it's a tough topic. It's something that probably a lot of people, especially with the baggage, a lot of people have it. Somebody has something. Somebody has something in their past. Somebody has something in past relationships that they're bringing to the table. And communication is key. If you talk about what you're bringing to the table, then you have the opportunity to work with what you're bringing to the table. So we always welcome feedback, comments, questions. Feel free to join in the call and comment or question anything that you might have.
Hi, I just wanted to tell you that all the points you're making are very valid, and I appreciated hearing what you had to say.
I think it's great. I had my introduction to it yesterday, and I feel like it's great to hear other dialogue from anyone about relationships, and it's important. I feel like to know that you're not the only one out there thinking certain thoughts about relationships, especially if you're in the dating world. So having sort of platforms like Affirm Relationship is extremely important, especially for the generations of today, so that we know we're not the only one out there and maybe going through the same sort of situations or challenges that everyone else is in the dating pool. So I'm excited to have such a platform out there for people to reach out to, and I think that it's great and that it's needed. Kudos to Lucinda. She did a wonderful job explaining intimacy and boundaries, and I look forward to her next call.
Oh, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So does anybody else have any questions, comments? We're just about out of time, so opening any of that up, I appreciate your feedback, as always. And like I said before, you can feel free to comment any topics that you feel like are important to the show or that you want to hear about. And again, thank you so much for listening, and keep listening. And so I really, looks like we are just about out of time. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening.